me tremendous pleasure to introduce Doug Gibson, who's been one of the central figures in Canadian publishing for decades. Doug started out as an editorial trainee at Doubleday in 1968. He moved up the ranks quickly and found himself running the editorial department at the age of 25. In 1974, he joined Macmillan as the editorial director and became publisher in 1979. In 1986, he joined McCullough and Stewart as editor and publisher, and he started his own editorial imprint, Douglas Gibson Books, and this was the first editorial imprint in Canada. He has presented at EAC conferences and conducted EAC seminars, and contributed the title chapter for EAC's booklet, Author and Editor.
That's not an EAC book.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a Writers Union book.
I'm so glad you're here, Lisa. My apologies, the audience. I know. So over the course of his long and illustrious career, Doug has had the occasion to work with some of the greatest Canadian literary talents, and I'm very excited to say that he's going to be introducing us to some of these characters. This is the second act of his one-man show. There will be other opportunities to see the full show. I hope you will go out and watch it. And the show is based on, has been developed and adapted from Doug's memoirs. You can see the cover here, Stories About Storytellers, and that's forthcoming from ECW Press in October. So, unfortunately, we don't have copies for sale now, but I hope this will wet your whistle for the book when it's published. Without further ado, Doug Gibson.
Thank you very much, Alison. This is not the first time, as Alison mentioned, that I've been involved in speaking to the EAC. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have been 15 years ago to the EAC conference in Ottawa.
Yep.
And that was where I was introduced by a very nice, conscientious young woman who said that she had been hard at work writing the introduction to Doug Gibson, and her roommate said, "What are you doing?" And she said, I'm to introduce Douglas Gibson, and I'm preparing that. And the roommate said, "Douglas Gibson, as in Douglas Gibson Books? You mean that's a real person?" She thought I was a kind of Betty Crocker, Ronald McDonald figure, a sly marketing device to sell books. So there you go. Yes, this is the real Doug Gibson. Alison asked me to give a talk here some time ago, and I said I was pleased to do it. I think it was on history of Canadian publishing. And then things sort of developed because I finished the book, and I thought I could do an interesting talk entitled "Harder Than I Thought. A Publisher Tries to Write a Book." And I've given such a talk, and I have interesting things to say, I think, about the basic fact that, surprise, surprise, books do not write themselves. And I learned this. But then in the course of having written the book and having found the publisher, and I'm delighted to see a sturdy representation from ECW Press come in with perfect timing. Yes, yes. I've learned a lot about the publishing process from the other side of the fence. But I've also learned, I think, a bit about storytelling. And the great light shone down upon me. And I thought, wait a minute. The book is called Stories About Storytellers. It consists of stories. I can take this show on the road and tell stories. So what I'm going to do is give you the second half of the performance. And I'll just whiz through, and I've passed a self-denying ordinance that as I show you Tony Jenkins' caricatures, Tony does not do flattery. But if I'm willing to subject other people, the authors who are the subject of these mini-biographies, to his treatment, it's only fair that I should suffer myself. So there you go.
Did you deliberately wear the same tie?
I'm a good sport. I deliberately wear the same tie. So I'm going to whiz through the first half, then we get to the intermission, And then after the intermission, it will be the real show, not just me chatting to my friends at PEAC. So let's go. But I'd like to begin Peter Newman piece by a direct quote, which goes, "That bastard Newman, you can't trust him." And the man uttering these indignant words was my boss at Doubleday Canada, a man named David Manuel. And he held in his hand two pieces of paper. And one was the copy of a letter from Peter Newman to him saying he was very sorry, he was not going to be able to keep his contract, he was returning the money because he was not going to deliver the promised book. That was disappointing. But on the other hand, he had a letter to Jack McClellan saying, "Dear Jack, this should fool those guys at Doubleday." And so David Manuel, who was a witty fellow, simply sent the letter back to to Peter Newman saying, "This seems to have gone to the wrong person." We were waiting to see how can you get out of it? And I guess we were secretly glad that Peter didn't belong to a culture where Harry Carey was a possibility. Yeah, it was terminal embarrassment. Not for Peter. Back comes a cheery letter saying, "Oh gosh, well, the males nowadays, you never know who's going to be a And he spreads goodwill around to everyone. He was, and right there, that was 1968, right there I learned that Peter Newman was not a saintly fellow. And he was going to be interesting to watch. And of course, he's been interesting for all of us to watch, because he was, as you're aware, a refugee who just got away from the Nazis as a young Czechoslovak, and made it briefly to London and then to Canada, age of 13. And he's always been, I would argue, a refugee, a guy sensing where the power is. And in fact, if you want to do an interesting piece of research, check how many of his books have the word power in the title or the subtitle, or even the opening line. He's really a power seeker, as I've said. But he's always been the refugee who tries to figure out who's in charge here, who do I have to befriend. Although an enemy has said that Peter Newman doesn't have any friends, he has sources. Anyway, I've known Peter down through the years. We always rubbed up against each other, and eventually I had the pleasure of working with him as his editor in 2004, when he was doing his memoirs, Here Be Dragons, and Power, Stories of People, Passion, and Power. And it was fascinating, and it did very well. And I enjoyed working with him, and he had fun. And he gave away the secrets of his publishing success. He told us about his Hey Mabel trick. The Hey Mabel trick is you every so often include a story that is so outrageous that the reader at home says, "Hey Mabel!" Listen to this. For example, and I apologize in advance if anyone is going to faint dead away at this story. In that book, he's writing about Barbara Emile's time in London before she met Conrad Black. He writes that when Algy Clough, chairman of The Spectator, invited her on a dinner date, she accepted, but warned him, "There's one thing I have to tell you. I won't be wearing any knickers." Now, the correct response, of course, is to ask, is that a threat or a promise? But good old Algy, who's presumably a refugee from some P.G. Wodehouse novel, Algy Clough's response is not noted. Now, Peter is remarkable because he invented types of books, became the master of that type, and then moved on. So, for example, with Renegade and Power, he invented, in Canadian terms, the disrespectful, hard-hitting Canadian political biography. Boom. And you'll recall that John Leadenbaker, who was not a grateful recipient of this treatment, called him the bouncing check. Not that he bore any ill will to find people in Czechoslovakia. It just was not intended to be a praising reference. And then he decided that corporate power was going to be the next big thing, and he wrote The Canadian Establishment. And spin-off after spin-off after spin-off. That huge successes, they became associated with Peter Newman. And then he decided that Canadian history was not necessarily just Pierre Burton's parish. And he significantly signed a $500,000 contract with Penguin to do the 2-volume history of the Hudson Bay Company. He was ahead of the game. This was before the big foreign companies were coming in and pouring lots of big money into advances. Peter was the first one, Penguin Canada. And he left McClellan and Stewart to do that. And he's still hard at work doing new stuff. And I must say, I'm full of admiration for his determination and his hard work. I mentioned Barbara, Emile, and knickers. Peter himself is something of an authority on knickers. His fourth wife, Alvy, once overheard, he's had 3 wives and God knows what else. And his astonishingly frank memoir gives an exhaustive list of ladies he had got to know very well indeed. And he tells us that when he was hard at work on a book, writing to the music of Stan Kenton, he'd get up at 4:30 in the morning. But he would take promising prospects to dinner the evening before. And around dessert, he would say to them, look, I'm to be in bed by 9:30, with you or without you. And he tells us this was astonishingly successful. So look for a totally new type of book for Peter Newman, the Peter Newman Dating Guide. And it will show that he's come a long way from the days when he claimed that he graduated from Upper Canada College so innocent about sex that he believed that oral sex meant that he talked a good game. Here Be Dragons was a huge success, and a very interesting bystander through all this was another of my authors, a fellow named Brian Mulroney. You may recall that Mulroney and Peter Newman had a deal that they would work as a team, and that every 10 days, a couple of weeks, Peter Newman would go to Mulroney's office, Prime Minister's office, and then he would sit and he would tape record what was happening in Mulroney's life. He was going to be the boss, and it was going to be a remarkable inside picture of what really happened in the Prime Minister's life. Something went wrong between them. It may have been the word team. In any case, it was wiped out, nothing was happening. But Mulroney was still
interested in my old friend Peter Newman's book. How's it?
And I would tell him his book was doing very well, and Brian would pretend to be pleased. And Peter, of course, was aware that I was working with Brian on his forthcoming memoir. Now, Peter's book did so well that, like a good publisher, I was working really hard to get him to sign up to do his next book with me. And somehow he was always absolutely in favor. Oh, absolutely, yeah, I'm keen to do it. Enjoy working, yeah. But it was never quite the right time. Well, I'm off on this magazine this time, and I'm doing this. So I never actually got to sign him up, and this was a bit of a mystery to me, until the day when my lovely wife Jane, who is an early riser, came into the bedroom at 7 o'clock and said, I think you'd better see this. And this was the front page of the Globe and Mail saying, Mulroney tapes revealed in secret Newman book. Headlines blown up. I got 2 really interesting phone calls that day. That morning. The first one was from Peter Newman. And this was about 9 o'clock, and he was delighted. Hey, Doug, you seen the glove? Hey, well, I guess you don't know. I didn't want to do the next book with you. He was delighted that he was the kid who'd built a stink bomb in the chemistry class, set it off, and boom, it was true. And he was so thrilled with himself, I couldn't stay mad at him in terms of working his friend. The next phone call was slightly different. And it was from a slightly different personality. It was from this man. And it tells a lot about Brian Mulroney, because he knew how small the world of Canadian publishing is. He knew that I'd been Peter Newman's editor and publisher. And he knew how hard it would be for a major book like this to be concealed from me. But instead of leaping to accuse me, as might have happened and would have led to hard words, he said,
I take it you knew nothing about this Peter Newman book.
I said, the third time, I read about it the first time in the London Magazine.
Okay. He's betrayed both of us.
He proceeded to do something about it. And what he did, since you all know the way the law is going to work, you can't publish tapes of someone who has not agreed to have the tapes published. And I believe that the Hospital for Sick Children is now a great deal richer thanks to Brian Mulroney's lawsuit. It was an interesting morning, but it was always interesting working with this man. People say, what was it like working with Brian Mulroney? Did you like it? And the answer is yes. I liked the experience, and I liked working with him. For a start, he wrote every single word of the manuscript in longhand himself. And to emphasize that in a world where not only hockey stars, but prime ministers and so on had ghostwriters, it's so remarkable to have someone who wrote his own book, word for word, that I, you may recall, ran pages from the manuscript, handwritten in the end papers. People could say, wow, he really did write this. So that was one piece of impressive background. And the other is I found him businesslike, and I found him very good at man management. You guys are publishing pros, so you'll understand what this is all about. He had a research director named Arthur Milne, and they've been saying, okay, when is the last time we can make any changes? And I said, okay, the last proofs go to the printer on Friday, so no changes. And then Friday morning I get a call from Arthur Milne. And he said, he called me the boss. The boss wants to make some changes. And I said, it's too late. Just too late. No. I mean, it's going off to the printer today. And he said, I told the boss you'd say that. Do you know what he said?
You told her that I know that he's the finest editor in Canada. And I know that he would never knowingly allow a book to go through that he could have corrected.
I swore aloud, and I ran to the typesetting post, and we made the change. And the courier came to take it to the printer 10 minutes later. And that was really, think of that, smart management. He got Arthur Milne to do the dirty call, and it worked. And I realized I was being flattered, but it worked. It worked. So I enjoyed working with him, and I am largely the man to blame if you feel that this 1,100-page book about Islam was too long. Because I sat down with him at his Montreal law office, and if you wonder what sort of law office does a former Prime Minister have, it's decorated just like a really rich person's cottage. So lots of rustic this and that, and couches and old armchairs and so on. And he sat there and he said,
Doug, am I spending too much time on Baco Hall?
and I said, no. Absolutely not. You're doing a lot about growing up in Baie-Comeau, but don't cut it at all, because in every sense it tells the reader where you come from. And you see I described him there, and deliberately as a boy from Baie-Comeau, and I believe that you understand Moroni if you understand. He grew up in this company town 14 hours away from the nearest city, Quebec City. 14 hours. So he was always the outsider, always the guy worried about money. And they grew up so poor, in fact, that he and his brother had to sleep in the basement around the basement heater so that they could free up a room for a paid lodger to come in and bring in some money simply to get the family through. And when you read that sort of detail, you start understanding this man. So I enjoyed working with him. I came to admire him, and I find that the book itself is a remarkable book by a remarkable man, now sadly fighting diabetes, and I wish him well.